I'm Lalasia Bialic-Murphy. I'm a lead scientist at ETH Zurich in the Crowther Lab, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the pace of life for forest trees. So the pace of life is really just a way of capturing and describing how species move through their life. So how fast they're growing, how long they're expected to live. And it's also the study of being able to forecast into the future of how a species will persist into environment, the probability of extinction, the density of the species over time, and how the environment and interactions are affecting those probabilities. Within ecology, there's been a great body of literature on this, and I'm going to overly simplify it, so for all the demographers out there, please forgive me. But in general, we can separate out animals and plants and thinking about how they move through life and their survivorship over time. And for animals, they're characteristic of having high survival early in life, and then over time, you have a senescence period where you start breaking down and having a higher probability of mortality. And that's thought to be driven by the fact that animals have a constraint as far as you have your organs that are expanding and growing and that slowly deteriorate over time. For plants, it's very different in the trajectory of how they age or they don't age, the lack of aging, where trees and plants in general tend to have really high mortality early in life, and that actually as they get bigger and older, they have a higher probability of living. So they kind of escape senescence and they don't have that same plateau of dropping off and having higher probability of death. And that's thought to have arisen by the fact that plants have this tremendous ability to regrow all of their organs. They regrow their leaves every year. They put on new branches. They can, even after being cut down, they can regrow all of their trunks. And so they're really highly dependent in interacting with the environment, and that their probability of death later in life has more to do with the environment than their body senescing. When we're thinking about through the lifespan of a tree, and predominantly when we're thinking about the diversity of different types of trees, we expect them to have very different strategies, and that's based on how they're responding to the environment and adapting to them. And in very coarse prediction that we would have is that there would be this kind of resource limitation that's constraining how much energy that an organism can allocate towards surviving, growing, and reproducing. So we're talking about light, water, and nutrients, and that over evolutionary time there should be this diversification where a species on one end would be allocating all of their resources towards growing really fast and being able to persist in that landscape by having really acquisitive strategy. And at the other end of the spectrum would be species that are very conservative, so they're slowly growing using resources at a lower rate, but they're allocating a lot more towards surviving and living a longer life. So there should be this theoretical continuum between species that are optimizing their fitness over kind of evolution to grow really fast and have short lifespans, and at the other end have really conservative growth and long lifespans. We're starting to see evidence of that continuum isn't as direct as we would expect it to be. But within this paper, we see that there is some evidence of that relationship, of the fast-slow continuum, if you will. But that when we start categorizing the dominant forms, the constraints on really fast-growing species seems to be present, where fast-growing species are constrained in how long they live. But then as we go into these more conservative sentinel tree species that live thousands of years, we see this kind of clustering or diversifying into three different strategies. So really slow-growing trees that take a really long time to get to larger sizes, separate out into high, intermediate, and low life expectancy groupings. calculating life expectancy of any organism takes doing actuarial statistics, where you take survival data and growth data, and using that information, we can, and actuarial statistics, you can convert that to a time of event, so how many years an organism will live. And you can use that information to calculate these basic things like the average lifespan or life expectancy of an organism. So one of the things that we found in this paper is that there's a strong predictor of temperature on kind of the pace of life of trees. It confirms a lot of like biogeography and macroecology expectations, where in the boreal regions we have massive constraints of cold temperatures that reduce the photosynthesis and metabolics, that constrain the species that can persist into that environment into being very slow, long-lived trees. But then as you go into the tropical zone, you have a wider variation in those strategies. And by clustering them into the kind of main growth forms, or kind of strategies based on their longevity and their growth, we see the emergence of kind of 4 dominant clusters, where you have the really fast-growing species and then some really extremely old trees that live similar lifespans as in the boreal region. So we just have more diversification that can be loosely categorized into those 4 kind of life histories. The idea for this project all started with a fun conversation about between Tom and I about what would I want to research if I had unlimited imaginary data and time. And I had been heavily influenced by a series of really great papers about tree ecology in the tropics and how trees are responding to the environment, so how temperature and drought is influencing lifespans of trees and so forth. And so I said, well, if I had any amount of time, I would want to start understanding tree ecologies at larger scales and being able to understand how does that influence climate change and their susceptibility towards extinction, how it's changing their life cycles, their longevity, and so forth. He then introduced me to a huge team of ecologists from around the world that have been collecting dynamic data for trees and compiling them into this large databases. So the TreeMart network and the Forest Plots network, which are hundreds of ecologists from around the world that are putting these data sets together. And I reached out to them and was humbled at first that they even wanted to collaborate on the project, and were willing to share their data with me, which I know is extremely challenging to get. I was a field ecologist for 10 years, so I know that amount of time and energy that takes. And so it was really humbling to have it, but it was also very exciting. And it has since evolved into a really fun collaborative research over the last 3 years with this huge network. And so it's really exciting that we're getting to be able to look at these large-scale patterns for trees and have the data to be able to do that. One of the things that I'm most excited about this work is that we first are being able to see large-scale patterns in just how long-lived trees are, which gives us quite a bit of just fundamental information. But also, as I had mentioned before, plants in general are way more exposed and responsive to the environment. And so when we think about climate change, for example, changes in temperature and precipitation is likely going to have a really massive effect on how fast trees are growing and how long they live. So it's going to shift their entire life cycles and pace of life, if you will. And so this kind of sets the foundation for starting to understand the climate impacts on these life cycles of how fast trees are growing and how long they live, which ultimately, when we think about scaling, has a huge effect on the sequestration of carbon, so how fast carbon is being sequestered within an environment, and how long it'll be retained within that environment. So the life expectancy of a tree has a huge impact, and the community of trees within an environment has a huge impact on the residence time of carbon. And so when we can start thinking about climate change and incorporating that, is really important for scaling our understanding of not only carbon, but nutrients and water fluxes through our environments.